Okay, we're going to carry on with chapter 13 and finish chapter 13 today. That's the aim. So quickly then, to briefly recap our lecture on Wednesday, we had begun to view the entire economy as if it were a single market, correct? And in this market, you have an aggregate demand curve and an aggregate supply curve. The word aggregate, of course, means total. So let me quickly replicate that diagram here. So this is the whole economy viewed as a single market. So you have all goods being measured, the quantities of all goods being measured along the horizontal axis. And of course, that is real GDP. Real GDP is our measure of all final goods and services produced. On the vertical axis, we measure the price level. And the price level really is the GDP price index divided by 100. But it's scaled down by 100. And I've explained that before. So you have real GDP and the price level. The price level we're going to denote by the letter P. So the price level is a measure of all prices. Now we have here a demand curve, which we call the AD curve. AD stands for aggregate demand. The word aggregate stands for total. Then we have also, in this diagram, an aggregate supply curve, which looks like this. So aggregate supply then stands for, rather AS stands for aggregate supply. And we have equilibrium in this economy, in other words, macroeconomic equilibrium, where the two curves intersect. So that is going to give us equilibrium real GDP and the equilibrium price level. So this is Y star, equilibrium real GDP, and this is P star, which is the equilibrium price level. This is what, I'm saying nothing new here, I'm just repeating stuff from our last class. Now, how do you view an economic recession? How would you view an economic recession in this diagram? Well, the way you would view it is by thinking of potential GDP to the right of Y star. This here is potential GDP, or full employment GDP. Right now, we know that at GDP level YF, what's going to be the unemployment rate? About 4%. Correct? Now, this Y star is smaller than YF. It's a smaller level of GDP than YF. Hence, fewer workers are needed to produce it. In other words, employment is going to be lower at Y star than at YF. Lower unemployment, of course, translates to higher unemployment. So we have here an unemployment rate that is greater than 4%, which means that in addition to the naturally unemployed, there are cyclically unemployed workers. In other words, we have a recession, because cyclical unemployment is the kind of unemployment associated with the business cycle. This gap here between Y star and YF is called the recessionary gap. Now, everything that we do in this course from now on will relate to this diagram, because what we are going to spend time discussing now is what can the government and what can the Federal Reserve Bank, these two entities, what can they do to help an economy climb out of recession? Now, in 2008, for instance, our economy, the US economy, entered a very deep and dangerous recession called the Great Recession, correct? We have now managed to climb out of it, economists say. And this was in large part because of the role of the Fed and the role of the government. And so we're going to spend time discussing what the Fed and the government can do. Now, we alluded to this already in class last time. We said that if the government and the Fed took steps to stimulate demand in the economy, meaning if they did something to cause the AD curve here to shift rightwards, then that would narrow any recessionary gap, perhaps eliminate it altogether, correct? Now you can view this quite easily by shifting this AD curve that you see here to the right like this. Now if the AD curve was shifted to the right like that, we would have a new equilibrium. Macroeconomic equilibrium would be there, and that would, of course, translate to a higher level of equilibrium real GDP, Y double star. And what has happened to the size of that recessionary gap? The recessionary gap is now smaller than it was. Am I correct? And in fact, if demand was stimulated enough, the recession might be entirely eliminated. In other words, the economy could be brought back to full employment, right? And what kind of a shift in the AD curve would be necessary to bring the economy back to full employment? Well, I'm going to work backwards here. I go to YF, and then I go vertically up like this till I strike the AD curve, right? And then there is where I draw the AD curve that is needed to bring the economy back to full employment. Is that correct? So we would then have macroeconomic equilibrium right there. So this is when the economy comes back to full employment. So if demand was stimulated sufficiently, we could help economies climb out of their recessions. That's the idea. Okay? We're going to spend the remainder of this class, which is about 40 minutes, discussing the AD and the AS curves in detail. So we are going to discuss exactly why the AS curve is positively sloped. So let me summarize what we are going to study now. Why is AS positively sloped? B, what factors could cause a change in aggregate supply, meaning shifts of the curve. Remember, the old terminology applies. We have changes in quantity along the curve, and we have changes in supply itself when the curve shifts. Right? So that old terminology continues to apply to this case. Right? We are also going to look at the same things in regard to AD. So if you replace AS here by AD, well, that too is something we will discuss. Of course, the AD is negatively sloped. Right? So why is AD negatively sloped, and what would cause AD to shift? So these are the things we will now spend the next 40 minutes quickly discussing. Okay? I'd like here to remind you of the relationship between labor use and the output of GDP. Okay? I'd also like to remind you of firms' demand for labor. So let me quickly here replicate those two diagrams that I had put up. I think it was on Monday that I did this. Okay, but let me quickly remind you. So we have these two diagrams. I'm going to draw them here quickly. The lower diagram is the diagram for the labor market. So we have the quantity of labor here, and we have the real wage there. And we have a demand for labor curve. We also have a supply of labor curve, which I'm not going to draw for now. Okay? And then in the upper diagram, we have again the quantity of labor along the horizontal axis. On the vertical axis, we have the output of real GDP. And this curve, if you recall, is concave to the origin. It's like this, if you recall, because there are diminishing returns to labor, right? All right, now let's ask the question. Why does the AS curve, why is it positively sloped? Why is AS positively sloped? Meaning, why is the AS curve like this? Why is it like that? Meaning, when the price level rises, from, let's say, P1 to P2, why do firms produce more real GDP than before? That's the question. When the price level rises, why do firms produce more output? Now remember, when we were discussing individual markets early on in this course, when we were studying demand-supply analysis, and I asked you, well, if the price of beef goes up, why does the quantity supplied of beef go up? In other words, why do beef producers produce more beef at a higher price for beef? What was your answer then? Yes, because there's more profit is really what the firm is after. A high price translates to more profit in a sense, right? So a higher price would induce the beef producer then to produce more beef. That was our simple logic, right? Could we apply that logic to the entire economy? In other words, when all prices rise, which is what the price level is, when all prices rise, does this lead to all firms then producing more output because there is more money to be made? Can we use that argument? And I'm going to tell you that we can't. We cannot use that argument. I'll tell you why. Let's say that you're a baker producing bread, and the price of bread doubles. But at the same time, the prices of all the other goods also double. Now you as a baker, you produce and sell bread, but you buy a bunch of other stuff. You sell bread, but you buy housing, fuel, food, etc., clothing. Am I correct? So if the price of bread doubles and your cost of living has also doubled, would you have any incentive to wake up earlier in the mornings to bake more bread? Would anything have changed for you? The price of bread's doubled, but your cost of living has doubled also. Nothing has changed for you. Am I correct? In real terms, nothing has changed for you. So why would you wake up earlier in the mornings to bake more bread? Now, this may become clearer with a slightly different example. Let's say you're in the business of selling your labor. You sell your labor in the labor market, right? And your wage, your paycheck doubles. But at the same time, your rent doubles, your car payments double, everything that you buy doubles in price. Would anything have changed for you? Would you have any incentive to then wake up earlier in the mornings to work longer hours because you are now making more money per hour? No, you wouldn't. Am I correct? And that's the point I'm making here. You see, now when we raise the price of bread, we're not just raising the price of bread. It's not ceteris paribus anymore. We are raising the price of, or the prices of, all final goods and services. Am I correct? So therefore, we can't use that old logic that if the price of a good goes up, the supplier of that good will produce more because there is more profit to be made, because there isn't now in real terms. Right? So we need another argument, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. Right? Now, what is the real wage? The real wage, if you recall, is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. So what is W? W is the nominal or money wage in today's dollars. And what is P? P is the price level. And we've defined the price level as the price index divided by 100. Is that correct? How do I get that? How did I get real wage is equal to W by P? because I know that real dollars are equal to the nominal dollars times 100 by the value of the price index, correct? But if you replace this multiplication sign by a division sign, then we have to flip that around. Am I correct? And this is what I'm calling the price level. So the real wage is equal to the nominal wage divided by the price level. Is that understood? Okay. Now I'm going to say something. I'm going to say that you have something called sticky wages in the short run. What is meant by sticky wages? Sticky wages means that wages are nominal wages, rather. Nominal wages are fixed or rigid in the short run. Why? Because of wage contracts. You see, at the beginning of any time period, the employer and the employee sign a contract. Am I correct? And for the duration of that contract, the nominal wage of the worker is fixed. Does that make sense? Is that the way the world works, do you think? That's how the world generally works. You enter into these short-term contracts. Even I, at the beginning of every year, have to sign a piece of paper saying, well, this is going to be my salary for this year. Right? Now, at the end of this year, the end of the contract period will result in the negotiation of a new contract. Right? But for the duration of this year, for the duration of this contract period, nominal wages are then fixed. Right? So I am therefore going to do the following. I'm going to write W with an overbar to indicate that it is rigid or sticky in the short term. Right? Now, if I divide this by P, what do I get? I get the real wage, right? Now, if I were to raise the price level, what happens to the entire fraction there? What happens to the real wage? If I have a fraction and I raise the size of the denominator, what happens to the fraction? It becomes smaller, am I correct? Is that right? For instance, 1 by 3, 1 by 4, which is smaller? Isn't it like that? And isn't it going to be like that? Yes? So the real wage then falls. Now, with the real wage falling from, let's say, here to here, what happens to the hiring of labor by businesses? What happens to the hiring of labor by businesses? Tell me. According to the labor demand curve that we have drawn here, the lower the real wage, the higher the quantity demanded of labor by firms. We've spoken about this before, correct? Now, when firms hire more labor, what happens to the output of real GDP? Well, when labor use was less, then the output of real GDP was this. On the other hand, when the real wage fell and firms increased their employment, then, of course, their output of real GDP went up. Do you see that? Because when firms hire more workers, those workers must be put to work, of course, and this will result in firms increasing their quantity supplied of real GDP. Is that correct? So the story here is when W is fixed, and the price level rises, this leads to the real wage falling. And when the real wage falls, firms hire more labor. And when firms hire more labor, the quantity supplied of real GDP by firms rises. correct? So what am I going to put together here to explain the positive slope of the AS curve? I have this, of course, price level rising, and then I have this. Do you follow me? If I connect these two up, do I not, sorry. If I connect these two up, do I not have an explanation for the positive slope of the aggregate supply curve? Price level rises, quantity supplied of real GDP by firms rises. Do you understand? So this is the explanation for the positive slope of the aggregate supply curve. Correct? And so what does it hinge upon? It hinges upon this. This is what it hinges upon. The fact that in the short term, nominal wages are fixed. So we've answered the question then. We've answered this question. Why is AS positively sloped? Our next question that we will now answer is, what factors might cause the aggregate supply curve to shift? What would cause changes in supply? Yes? Factors causing a change in aggregate supply. Okay? I am again going to draw quickly an aggregate supply curve. Real GDP, price level, aggregate supply curve. Let's say the price level is currently P1. And at that price level, the quantity supplied of real GDP may be read off the aggregate supply curve. And so the quantity supplied of real GDP is Y1. Okay, now we are going to keep the price level unchanged. Because when we speak of shifting curves, we're holding the price constant. Am I correct? Right? Because we're talking about horizontal shifts of the curve. So the price level is held constant. So we have an overbar over the price level. But if, let's say, for some reason, the nominal wage were to fall, for some reason, let's say the nominal wage fell, and for instance, that reason may be high unemployment in the economy. If there are lots of desperate unemployed workers around, then firms may think they can get away paying their workers a lower nominal wage. Do you follow me? So it could be something like that, for instance. Whatever the reason, let's say the nominal wage drops. What is going to be the implication of this for the real wage, which is W by P? W falling, P constant. So P is constant, but W is falling. That causes the entire fraction to, quickly, if you have the numerator of the fraction falling, what's going to be the, so for instance, 4 by 5, 3 by 5, 2 by 5. What's the direction of, correct? So if the numerator falls, it's going to cause the fraction to reduce in size. Real wage falls. Now when the real wage falls, what happens? What happens to the quantity demanded of labor by firms, which is the lower diagram here, this lower diagram? With the real wage falling like that, the quantity of labor demanded by firms rises, and this then translates to, in the top diagram, to a larger production of real GDP. Is that correct? So let's translate this to our present diagram. And so instead of GDP Y1 being produced, we are now going to have a GDP level Y1 prime being produced. More GDP at the same price level. In other words, we have a shift from this particular quantity supplied price combination to a horizontal shift like this, to that combination. So we have a shift from point A to point B. And why is this happening again? The cause of it is this, which is falling nominal wage. That's the cause. Right? Now, point B, as I've said before, doesn't lie out there in space. Instead, what's true about point B? Lies on a whole new supply curve. Is that correct? So point B lies on a whole new AS curve, one that is to the right of the original one. So this has resulted in an increase in what? So this leads to an increase in the production of real GDP. And that is our increase in aggregate supply, because this is happening at a constant price level. So what we are doing here is we are bringing these two together. Same price level, bigger output of real GDP. This must, of course, be a rightward shift of the AS curve, right? So what I have just demonstrated to you is this. When the nominal wage falls, aggregate supply increases, which is a rightward shift. When the nominal wage, on the other hand, rises, which would be the opposite, well, that will lead to a rise in the real wage, given the price level is constant. And so aggregate supply would decrease, and this would be a leftward shift. So that's one factor then. Factors causing a change in aggregate supply. So what would our first factor be then? Changes in the nominal wage. That's our first factor. And now I'm going to talk about a second factor. A second factor would be changes in the money costs of other inputs, other than labor, that is, because we have already dealt with changes in the money cost of labor. That would be the nominal wage. Correct? So point number one already talks about changes in the money cost of labor. So now point number two is changes in the money costs of other inputs, besides labor, that is. And what might these other inputs be? One example of a universal input is energy. Energy is used by really all businesses. So let's say that the price of oil rises. If the price of oil were to rise, this would cause energy costs to go up, and this would then cause the supply of all firms in the economy to reduce. So the AS curve would then shift leftward. Now, let me ask you a question from way back. What would happen to the farmer's supply of wheat if the cost of fertilizer rose? Do you remember that type of question? What would happen to the farmer's supply of wheat if the cost of fertilizer rose? The farmer would supply less wheat, wouldn't he? Because fertilizer is an input in the production of wheat. And we know that when the cost of raw materials rise, there is a decrease in supply. So we are now talking about these other raw materials that are, in a sense, universal, like energy. Right? So that is our second factor that causes a change in aggregate supply. Changes in the money costs of other inputs. The third factor is changes in potential GDP. And let me explain that. Changes in potential GDP. I am now going to, in this diagram here, I'm going to mark off, or let me go to a new page. I'm going to again quickly draw the AS curve and now tell you how it might shift because of a change in YF. Real GDP, price level, aggregate supply. And I'm going to mark off here YF. This is potential GDP. So I'm now going to mark off this particular point on the AS curve that relates to GDP level YF. This point is called the anchor point of aggregate supply. It's called the anchor point. Now, let's say that potential GDP of the economy increases from YF to YF prime. Potential GDP goes up. Now, what might cause that to happen? What might cause potential GDP to go up? Let's look at this diagram here. And let me, in this set of diagrams to the left, let me quickly draw in a labor supply curve. Now, we know that when the labor market comes to equilibrium, well, that's the full employment level of employment. Is that correct? And if we project this up to the diagram on top there, this gives us, this is what? That happens to be YF. We've learned this, is that correct? Now let's say that something were to happen here in this diagram that would cause YF to go up. What might that be? Well, one reason might be that a change in technology, an improvement in technology makes workers more productive. You see, so if we have a change in an improvement in technology that makes workers more productive, what happens to the labor demand curve in this diagram? The labor demand curve shifts to the right. You see, with more productive workers, workers become more attractive to firms. Firms hire more workers. So what happens to the full employment level of employment then? The full employment level of employment now increases to that. And when you project this up to the production function, well, that translates to a higher level of YF. Do you see that? So this could be one factor that causes the economy's potential GDP to go up. Improvements in the productivity of labor brought about, by instance, by improvements in technology. Other reasons could be, for instance, the discoveries of new resources. Because remember, labor has to work with the other three resources: capital, entrepreneurship, and land, right? So if, for instance, the economy decides to invest and build up its capital stock, meaning machinery, then workers will have more machines to work with and they will become more productive therefore. And hence, firms' demand for them will go up because a more productive worker is a more attractive proposition for a firm, right? When a firm is hiring a worker, what's the calculation the firm's making? Well, I need to pay this guy so much, but he makes for me so much. But if he makes for me more now because he's more productive, well, that would make hiring him a more attractive proposition for me, the firm, right? So therefore, coming back to our current diagram here, if YF were to go up, what happens to the anchor point is the question. Well, if I go up like this, perhaps I should extend this a bit like that, okay? So we now have a new anchor point, and this shall be the new anchor point. Oh, hang on, no, I'm sorry. You might please erase that. That's not quite correct. Rather, the new anchor point shall be like this. This shall be the new anchor point. So with an increase in YF, we have a horizontal shift rightward of the anchor point of the AS curve. Now with that new anchor point, of course, you are going to need a brand new AS curve. And what is that AS curve going to look like? Is that correct? So the AS curve is shifted to the right. And why has this shift happened? It's happened because of an increase in the economy's level of potential real GDP. So that was the third factor, which is in this slide. So we have now understood that. Is that correct? We now have an understanding of this last factor. This relates to the anchor point of the AS curve. So we've dealt with AS. Now, quickly, in the time that I have left, talk about AD. So again, two questions. Why is the AD curve negatively sloped? And what would cause the AD curve to shift? Let's start with the first. Why is AD negatively sloped? And there are three reasons here. First is called the real balance effect. The second one is called the foreign trade effect. And the third one is called the interest rate effect. And what are these effects quickly? The real balance effect works like this. We have a certain amount of monetary wealth, let's say money in the bank. If the price level falls, this makes our money in the bank seem like more, because you can buy more with it, with a fall in the price level. So therefore, you and I begin to feel wealthier. And when we feel wealthier, what happens to our consumption spending? It goes up. In other words, the quantity demanded of real GDP by us goes up. So what do we have here? Price level falling, and the quantity demanded of real GDP rising. Now, doesn't this explain the negative slope of the AD curve? Right? When the price level falls, the quantity demanded of real GDP rises. Who are the people who demand real GDP? Who are the ones behind this AD curve? You have the four shoppers, so to speak. Am I correct? The four shoppers. Who are the four shoppers? Households, the government, firms, and the rest of the world. So now we're saying when the price level falls, our monetary wealth increases, we feel wealthier, hence we go shopping more, and that is one reason for the negative slope of the AD curve. Now for the second one, foreign trade effect. When the US price level falls, I'm going to put US there to indicate that this is our price level, American goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods. Now when American goods become cheaper relative to foreign goods, this leads to two things. First, it leads to foreigners buying more of our goods rather than their own goods, because our goods have become cheaper. So our exports rise. Secondly, we Americans, we buy less foreign-made goods because our goods have become cheaper. So imports fall, and the implication, of course, for that is net exports shall rise, because a rise in exports causes net exports to rise. A fall in imports causes the same thing to happen. And net exports are one component of AD, as you know. So once again, we have the price level falling, and we have an increase in this component of the quantity demanded of real GDP. And now, lastly, the interest rate effect. Now here, the explanation is quite simple. If the price level falls, meaning everything becomes cheaper, you and I need to carry less money in our pockets for our day-to-day expenses. So what do we do with the money that we don't need to carry with ourselves anymore? Because everything's become cheaper. Put it in the bank. And when we put our money in the bank, banks have more money to lend. Right? So banks start to push loans, because when they have all this money, our money, lying with them, what do they do with it? They need to make some money off that money. And the way they do that is by lending that money, right? So in order to attract borrowers, banks would, in a sense, or the market for loans would work in such a way as to cause the interest rate to fall, right? So what am I saying here? I'm saying the price level falls, and this causes the interest rate to fall, R being the interest rate. Now, when the interest rate falls, we know that that causes consumption spending to go up and investment spending to go up, at least those two. Why is that? Because a lot of consumption and a lot of investment spending is financed by credit. So when interest rates fall, then you and I are more likely to take out that new car loan to buy a car. We're more likely to use our credit cards to buy stuff. So consumption spending is going to rise. What about investment spending by businesses? The purchase of new machinery by businesses, in other words. Will that change? Yes, because firms also often borrow money with which to buy machinery. And you make the terms of that borrowing easier on firms, and firms are more likely to borrow money and then go shopping for machinery with it, roughly. Correct? So we have an increase in these two components of AD, and once again, this leads to an increase in the quantity demanded of real GDP. So these are the three reasons for the negative slope of the AD curve. Now, quickly, shifts of the AD curve. Now, I'm going to break this up into C, I, G, and X minus N quickly. And I have sufficient time to do this. So let's look at the component C. This is one component of AD, because AD consists of C, I, G, and. So let's look at each separately. What are the influences in C? Now, remember, when we speak of shifts of the curve, we are going to be holding the price level constant. The price level is going to be constant there. And we would have a horizontal shift from point A to point B. That's what we're talking about, correct? So here are the factors that might cause consumption to change, and therefore the AD curve to shift rightwards. First, changes in government taxes. If the government charges you less taxes, you are left with more income to spend, and hence your shopping will go up. Okay? Changes in expectations of future income and prices. If consumers expect that their income is going to be higher in the future, they may already begin to spend more on consumption. If consumers expect prices to be higher in the future, that's again when they will go and spend more today to stock up on goods before prices rise. Right? A third factor may be changes in household wealth. If your wealth increases, and your wealth could increase because of such things as a boom in the real estate market, because your home is your commonest form of wealth holding. For most Americans, their home is their principal source of wealth. So if home values were to go up, for instance, households may feel wealthier. And when they feel wealthier, they go and shop more. A booming stock market might do the same thing, because lots of people own stock. So any increase in household wealth would also trigger an increase in consumption spending. And all of these factors would cause this move from point A to point B here. In other words, all of these would cause the AD curve to shift like this, to the right. Now let's move to investment spending. And this would depend upon changes in business taxes, the taxes that businesses pay. If businesses are charged less taxes, they will be left with more of their revenues to spend on new machinery. So a lowering of the corporate tax rates, for instance, would work to stimulate shopping by firms for new machinery. Secondly, changes in firms' expectations of future sales and profits. If businesses are optimistic about the future, If businesses are optimistic about the future, that's when they will go and buy new machinery. On the other hand, if they are pessimistic about the future, they are unlikely to build new factories, buy new machinery. Is that correct? Now let's look at net exports. Now this would depend upon two things. First, economic conditions abroad. If Mexico were to have a recession, what would that do to the number of Mexicans coming across the border to shop here in Brownsville? If the Mexican economy went down, would there be more Mexican shoppers here in the States or less? Yes. So, in other words, if the economies of our trading partners suffer recessions, well, that will lead to a decrease in our exports to them because they won't have the money to buy our stuff. Am I correct? So economic conditions abroad would affect net exports negatively. Worsening economic conditions would affect net exports negatively. Improving economic conditions abroad would work the other way. So improving economic conditions abroad would shift the AD curve rightwards because there'd be more shopping by foreigners for our goods. Right? Secondly, the exchange rate, and this is the last thing that I will say today, the exchange rate. If the dollar becomes stronger, in other words, more pesos to the dollar, will that cause more Mexicans to shop in the States or less? Less, am I correct? So a stronger dollar leads to a reduction in net exports, a leftward shift of the AD curve. On the other hand, a weaker dollar is better for our AD because a weaker dollar stimulates exports. One last thing, if you don't mind. Government spending. Why have I left that for the end? Because government spending is part of the government's deliberate policy. It doesn't depend on anything. But one fact is that if the government raises its spending, well, this, of course, by itself is going to cause the AD curve to shift rightwards. Why is that? Because government spending is a part of AD, right? So if G goes up, AD is going to go up because G is a part of AD. But there is more than that to the story. If G goes up, there will in fact be a multiplied effect on AD. If G goes up by $1, we will shortly learn that aggregate demand may go up by $10. There is a multiplied effect of a change in government spending, right? But here are the factors that cause the AD curve to shift, and that, I think, should take care of Chapter 13. If there are a few sundry points left over, I will discuss these on the Monday after spring break. Okay. Have a good break.